This Shed Online handyman video deals with some basic plastering techniques you can use when fixing a hole in a wall. Firstly, let's have a look at what happens when you put a hole in a piece of plasterboard. Just imagine that this is a wall. Now, from the outside, it may look as though the hole is quite small, but if you look around at the other side, you can see that the plaster is blown out, a bit like a flower. It actually looks a lot worse on the side you can't see. It's important to clean up the hole first. Use a Stanley knife to do this, but careful of your fingers. Now, here's the trick. When cleaning up the hole, make sure you angle the blade so that the edges slope inwards. Think of it as cutting the sides of a V shape. This will give the new plaster something to stick to, rather than just falling out through the back of the hole once it's set. It's okay to leave the bits hanging out the back where you can't see them. They also give the new plaster something to stick onto. Smaller holes can be filled up with a good amount of stopping plaster. Stopping plaster is a thicker mix that is used for filling gaps and cracks. There are a few different types of plaster mix. Your local hardware store can help advise you on what to use for a particular job. If you've got a bigger hole in a wall, you're going to need to use a piece of plasterboard to patch it up before you apply wet plaster. We've cleaned this hole up by cutting it out in a nice rectangle shape. You can use a knife to do this, or a small handsaw. Watch out for electrical wires that might be running behind the plaster when you're doing this. You'll need to make sure the plaster insert has something to stop it falling through the wall. Use a couple of flat pieces of wood. Insert them behind the plaster and screw them in. You'll be covering over the screws later. Put a piece at the top and another one down at the bottom. Now your plaster patch will be nice and solid. Measure up the hole, then cut yourself a piece of plasterboard that is roughly the same size. Perfect fit. Mark where the noggins in the wall are. You'll need to know this when you are screwing in the new piece of plasterboard. Screw the plasterboard piece in place. Now Herman, our expert plasterer, is using a pretty fancy screw gun. You can just use your cordless drill or screw it in by hand. Clean up the hole using the angled blade technique we talked about earlier. Cutting the edges of the plasterboard in a V shape will help the stopping plaster stick firmly in the gaps. Now we're ready to fill in the gaps with stopping plaster. You can also use cornice cement, which is pretty common for patching up holes. Mix up a new lot though. It's no good using plaster that has already started setting. Don't mix in any old plaster when you're making a new batch. Remember, plaster hardens via a chemical reaction. It doesn't dry, it actually sets. You can't just add water to plaster that has already started to get hard. The chemical reaction is already underway. Here's a plastering tip from the pros. Mix your plaster on a flat surface. It's much easier to clean up afterwards, and you don't get old plaster building up like you do in the corner of a bucket. Add the water bit by bit, so that it doesn't run everywhere and make a mess. Use a trowel to apply a good amount of your plaster mix to the area. Make sure you get it nice and flat, but be careful not to overfill the holes. Too much plaster can cause problems. Press really hard, right down to the plasterboard surface. That will set in about an hour. Once it's pretty hard, you can lightly scrape off any of the rough bits with your scraper tool. Then you're ready to apply the base coat. It's not as thick as the cornice cement we use to fill in the gaps. Check with your hardware store for what's the best to use. Apply enough to get a nice smooth finish. You should be able to get it so that the joins are nearly indistinguishable. Work on the edges with your scraper to get a really neat finish. Let it dry for 24 hours. Then you can go ahead and give it a light sanding. Before you paint the wall, you'll have to apply a sealer primer undercoat. To avoid having the paint soak into the plasterboard, remember, plasterboard is actually a pretty absorbent material. So there you have it. Maybe you can have a crack at patching up the walls in your place. Let us know if you give it a go. Remember, there's a handyman DIY forum on the discussions page of the Shed Online website. Come back again next month for some more handy hints. Till next time, Shedders.